So look, I'm just going to do an introduction before I do the welcome, so just bear with me for a moment, because this is the context for what we're about to have a go at doing. One of the great challenges for people working in our business is how do you garner political support? It's something that worries us and is on our mind, and if you look back, you know, the great public urban parks of Australia and New Zealand are the legacy, or the far-sighted legacies of early governments. They were influenced by surveyors and planners who no doubt were trying to emulate the best of English cities. And although there were early national parks prior to Federation in Australia, the glory days of national parks in Australia and New Zealand are really the 70s and the 80s, and perhaps even the 90s. But and over that period of 40 years, if you go back 40 years, you could argue that support for parks, urban, rural, national, has probably been strong. And the question that is on our minds today is, in fact, is that changing? Is it something that's dissipating? That in fact support for our business is on the wane? And with that in mind, and the fact that this audience are park professionals, people that see this as vocational and they come to it with a passion. If you're like whalers and it's a dying profession, what will you do? Do you accept the fate? And so I thought it'd be worth our while getting a view from some politicians or former politicians. And so that's the method in the madness, if you like. That's what today's about. And so to the introductions, to my immediate right is Dr. Susan Close, a recently elected member for the seat of Port Adelaide here in our state parliament, who has had a lifetime's experience in environmental politics. Susan's worked in the conservation movement, in university administration. I'm not sure what she did to deserve that, and most recently as a senior public servant in South Australia. Now I'll be careful what I've said there, because the next two guests have actually moved from politics into the academic institutions and perhaps have a different view.
Going up.
Professor John Thwaites is a former Deputy Premier of Victoria, Environment Minister in the Bracks government. He's now Professorial Fellow at Monash University, Chair of Climate Works Australia at the Monash Sustainability Institute. He also chairs Climate Group Limited, the Peter Cullen Environment and Water Trust, and the Australian Centre for Moving Images. And next to John Thwaites is Professor Robert Hill, a former senator and leader of the government in the Senate, served as Minister for Environment for 6 years, is now Adjunct Professor of Sustainability at the US Studies Centre, University of Sydney, heads the Australian Carbon Trust, and is Chancellor of the University of Adelaide. So what I would like each of my guests to do is just to spend a few minutes giving their views of parks and urban parks, open spaces today, their relevance, their support, and whether in fact my contention that their support politically is on the wane. So I might start with John, seeing you're in the centre.
Thanks, Alan. Well, I'm afraid I don't agree with you. I don't think there is any particular evidence that political or public support for parks is on the wane. I think these things always have a bit of an ebb and flow, and we're certainly at a time where governments around the world are somewhat restrained in their resources, and so that's putting some pressure on parks. But if you look at the number of people who are visiting parks and the experience they're having, as far as I can see, parks are going pretty well. And in terms of my own experience in Victoria and Melbourne, in recent years we've actually established new urban parks, particularly in the west of Melbourne. And when I first became Minister for Environment, one of the first things I did was just look at the way in which parks were placed around Melbourne, and saw that they were all in the eastern suburbs, the wealthy suburbs. And there are almost no parks in the north and west, despite the fact there was a lot of very important natural values to protect there. So the new parks in Melbourne were in, and have recently been in the west of Melbourne and the north. And that is encouraging a whole new group of people who didn't have access to parks to enjoy them. And so I guess the concluding point I'd make is I think the key to building and maintaining success is broadening access and encouraging people that may not traditionally have accessed parks, people from different cultural groups, language groups, social groups, to use and enjoy parks.
Thanks, John. Just before I move to Robert, I'm just interested in your relationship with the park professionals and the way you found that group of people in terms of their views about what their jobs were and whether it aligned with a politician's view. Because I'm conscious of the debates that I have with my minister from time to time, and the frustration he sometimes expresses about if only they would listen to what I want them to do. So,
well, I can honestly say I really enjoyed my relationship with Parks Victoria. I had a fantastic relationship with Parks Victoria, I believe. A lot of respect for Mark Stone, who was head of Parks Victoria. And I spent a lot of my time, I think, protecting Parks Victoria from the ravages of the department, who kept trying to step in at times and tell them what to do. And why was that? Because I respected the way Parks Victoria had a culture and a value system that demonstrated they were dedicated to their job, which was protecting and promoting our parks. And they weren't just subject to the vagaries of politics and trying to sniff which way was the political breeze going. They were very dedicated to parks. So I respected that. I always enjoyed my time with a lot of the park rangers and spent a lot of time visiting parks. And we've heard from some of the success stories of Indigenous co-management. I think there were some fantastic Indigenous people involved in parks that I learned a lot from too. So I found it as a minister, I might say having been health minister before that, one of the best jobs you could have, to go around parks with people that love parks.
Did your views change in terms of how you saw conservation and park management?
Yes, they did. I think the one, and this is where Mark Stone was very strong, which was about engaging with groups that were not traditional park supporters. So he really led the way with encouraging people like four-wheel drive groups who traditionally had opposed parks to come on board by giving them a role in track management. And the Sporting Shooters Association, once again, not an organisation traditionally lovers of parks, but we got them involved in feral animal management in parks, and suddenly they became great supporters. We did draw the line at the mountain cattlemen, but they were what they were doing was causing damage, whereas the four-wheel drivers and the sporting shooters could actually assist with good management of parks. So I guess the one thing I learnt is that in managing parks, we should be reaching out to groups that may not traditionally have been supporters and involving them in management.
Thanks, John. Robert, similar questions to you. So just the long perspective, your views on conservation and park management and open space, waxing, waning, much the same?
Well, I guess much the same. From a Commonwealth perspective, perhaps we didn't so much think of parks as protected areas. Parks were a particular form of protected area protected by a piece of legislation, generally state legislation. So in many ways, my dealings with parks was through state authorities, except for the parks, which we said were extra special, that the Commonwealth had ultimate responsibility for. generally pursuant to international conventions. So whether it's the World Heritage Convention with Kakadu or Uluru or the Great Barrier Reef or Ramsar conventions or many other conventions, our responsibilities in relation to Antarctica and so forth. I think we tended, because our responsibility was based on the commitments in those conventions, we tended to focus a bit more on the values that we were seeking to protect rather than a park per se. Now, that led to some interesting discussions, which you might remember, Alan, seeing you've been around a while, at various ministerial meetings between states and commonwealths as to who was doing the hard work.
Yes.
Because the states had a feeling that they were doing much more of the on-the-ground, day-to-day management responsibility, and we were off doing the international conferences and dictating to the states how they should see things differently. Where do I see it all now? I think it's still as complex as ever, and just a coincidence, I've spent the last 3 days on an Indigenous protected area in Western Arnhem Land out on the plateau, the Waterton Indigenous protected area. It's not a park, but it's protected, and it's protected because the Aboriginal owners have committed it for its conservation values and committed themselves to protect it, and taken a responsibility for management, and being willing and welcoming to work with Western trained scientists as well to share experiences and learning and manage it even better than has been managed in the past. And I think there's a lot more of that in Australia now. So I think when I was a kid, a park was basically an area for recreation. I think the community now sees parks or protected areas as something more complex, a set of values, whether it's biodiversity, landscape, or whatever, that should be conserved, and should be conserved not for this generation, but for generations forever. So,
look,
is that answering the question? I'm not sure.
Well, it does to a degree. I suppose, though, that I think if I took a straw poll of this audience, they would say that they are concerned that they're losing public participation and public support, that kids of today are probably disconnected to the natural world, and for a whole lot of reasons, for technology or the way our society's going. Now, I'm wondering whether there is, whether that's something that you think we've just glass half empty.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I don't see it that way. Again, my last few days' experience, the kids I was with all had GPSs, and they were mapping bird sites and the like. They weren't discarding the new technologies, but they were also using them to enhance a values experience. So I think perhaps you're being a little pessimistic. I think that.
So a cheeky question, allowed one, I think. Given that I did save your life, if you recall.
No, I don't remember
Robert.
that.
You don't recall this. We were driving through Wattaroo, an Indigenous protected area in north of South Australia, in a new Nissan four-wheel drive, and the back wheel passed us, and I was driving with Robert in the front seat, I think, and we managed to stay upright. I thought it was a pretty good effort, really, all things considered. It was a long time ago. Is that your recollection as well?
It's one of those things you never forget. It was a surreal experience because something seemed to be going wrong with the car and we couldn't work out what it was. And when we sort of slid to a halt, we got off and one of the wheels was missing. We thought, well, that's pretty serious.
It was very serious.
And then we couldn't find the wheels.
That's right, it took us some time.
So Alan drove us on 3 wheels for some considerable distance.
It was a great feat. Look, my cheeky question is, do you think there is a significant difference in right and left in terms of how they see conservation and these environmental issues?
Do I think there's a difference?
Yeah.
No, not really. What, left or right?
Yeah, in terms of the Conservatives and Labor.
I suppose there's been, on our side, I don't call myself a Conservative, as you just labelled me, but on to the right of centre side anyway, if I put it that way, we would say, but others might argue that it's not the case, that we were more interested in supporting non-government conservation and protected areas. And it is true to say, from a Commonwealth perspective, around my period, there was a lot more public investment in the development of private conservation areas. And that has continued to grow, and it continues to grow across the world. But I think it's just as embraced now by the left of centre side. Okay. It wasn't necessarily welcomed by all the professionals in the business, Alan, if I remember, at the time. But
change is always difficult, isn't it?
Many professionals in the business now recognise the task is too great to be managed just by governments.
John, a quick view before I go to Susan?
Well, I don't think there's a simple left-right thing. I think it's, in my opinion, the National Party doesn't have a fantastic record when it comes to parks, and my experience in Victoria is that they've tended to oppose the establishment of parks and not particularly supportive, whereas the Liberal Party in Victoria has had a very long history of not only support for parks but very good policy initiatives like the Victorian Environment Assessment Council. And people like Rupert Hamer were great supporters. So I think it's not a simple left-right thing, but it's certainly political. And as I say, I think the National Party has used parks as a bit of a political lever at times to seek to get country votes.
Okay. Susan, sorry to leave you to last, but cover the broad range.
I was very interested in what Robert was saying about really questioning what parks are, because that's really where I wanted to start. What does it mean to be a park, and a parks agency versus environment agency? How much are the parks part of, or much of, the delivery of an environment agenda, and how much is that delivered elsewhere? So it's kind of the bleeding edges of parks that I'm interested in. My own history, which has some analogies to what we're talking about, I think. I started off being brought up with extreme camping by my parents. I have slightly eccentric English parents, and my father in particular is a mad birdo, and so I got dragged around the state very early on, just in a mini with child, dog, to adults and everything just on top, and we would just go off Book Road. I did not know that people used proper toilets when camping until I was about 15, because for me camping was just you go off the road and you stop, and then you spend the whole time losing your father because he's looking for birds. But so my experience of parks was the regional parks that are there primarily for biodiversity, or for people who are prepared to shed the trappings of civilization in order to go and be part of biodiversity. My sort of skipping over all of the time in between, what I've just started to do is be a Member of Parliament for a metropolitan seat for Port Adelaide, which is not a rich area, but has quite a lot of biodiversity, but it's highly compromised biodiversity. And it is very intensive with heavy industry, as well as a lot of other commercial activities, and a lot of people living there. So what I've experienced when going around door knocking, and I had a by-election, for those not here, which was a very intensive by-election, and I door knocked on literally thousands of doors in a period of about 3 months. People didn't talk to me about parks, but they did talk to me about the environment, largely in the context of their experience of the environment, whether that be the preservation of the biodiversity that they saw nearby, or their experience of getting out and having a place to go and having a place for their children to go. Now, where the parks agenda sits with that, I think, is one of the challenges for people who are parks professionals. Are you mainly interested in a biodiversity store that preserves is the backbone of the conservation effort and preserves large swathes of land? And when you've got a bit of money to spend on it, you do. Or are you interested in what happens outside those parks that is similar, so as Robert said, the private conservation efforts? And how interested are you in what happens right in the middle of a city, where the biodiversity may be quite highly compromised but nonetheless exists and can come back, but is where the people are and the people's experience of the environment? And if I might, before I finish, there was one little element I was musing on, which is around children's experience of the environment agenda, the bigger agenda. We are dealing with a huge range of issues associated with the environment and climate change as a world. We know that, and everyone in this room knows that. How you communicate that to the children in a way that doesn't overwhelm them and make them turn off is a huge challenge for us, and I suspect parks are going to be part of that, the experience that children have. My son, when he was 4 in preschool, came home one day. They'd had a special person come and talk to them about water and announced to me that there would be no water in the taps when he grew up. Now, I think that's a devastating thing to do to a 4-year-old. What a 4-year-old should be doing is getting dirty and enjoying the environment, feeling the environment's a bit bigger than them and is fun and not something that's precious and about to go. And I would like to see that the parks discussion for young people being there before we overwhelm them and let them give up all chance.
So just a comment on those last points that you make. If you look at the audience, we span that range of far away national park, biodiversity conservation, through to urban open space, beaches. So we cover that broad range of territory, and there is some possible barriers between that in terms of how we see our role. Can you do both, and how do they connect? But I do think there is a realisation that if you don't engage the people, and you'll do that through your urban setting, then you won't engage them in the conservation areas, the conservation reserves, and that's part of the dilemma for people that work in this field. How do they balance that? And so I've already been joking with people that work for me to say that I've issued an edict that mountain bikes can traverse all of our parks and the Hills Face Zone, provided they stay on management vehicles only. And somebody said, well, you have to do every other management plan. And I said, well, no, I'm not going to do it. I've given an order. But you're not able to do that. But my concern is that we lock people out. We don't invite them in. We don't engage them. And I suppose it's that tension that I'm interested in, a perspective of a politician about the balancing of inviting people in. And when Enrique Penaloza spoke this morning, his view was that parks were entirely for people. Now, Enrique is talking about urban parks, but the sentiment in Enrique was that if they're not for people, they're for nobody. I think that was where you were coming from. So again, I'm interested in your perspectives on those things, those balances.
Well, I think if you lock up your parks, you're going to lock out your support in the future. So there are some negatives with bringing people in. Obviously, pests and can be brought in when people come in. If you're absolutely interested only in protecting the biodiversity, maybe you wouldn't encourage people in. But the political reality is that you have to get support of the community if you're going to have a well-supported park system. And it's not, of course, just setting up the parks. I think the big challenge for parks these days is getting enough resources to manage them properly. So you've got to get political support in a budget sense to put money into maintenance and improvement of parks. And you'll only get that, once again, if people feel ownership and engaged with the parks.
Well, I suppose that was really my point about support waning, in that my sense as somebody that's been in this business a long time is that in fact we're losing that we're not enjoying that public support that translates into political support. And that's what I was trying to test out. And I didn't hear you saying that was the case, that you weren't observing that. So perhaps either I've got a jaundiced view or I'm seeing ahead of time what might be ahead.
Well, I guess the hardest areas I had to do in that area generally were the marine protected areas, where you will determine that part of it is a no-take zone, totally protected, and there'll always be someone who's upset with that decision. And recognising you can't, you might say, ideally I'd like to make that as wide as I can to protect as much of the conservation values as is possible. But if it's too wide, then I'll have a revolution on my hands and lose the lot. So you've then got to try and determine what are reasonable, sustainable takes at the same time to complement it. And you never please everybody in those decisions, but overall, people will accept it and will still go and take what the pleasures as they see it, and quite often generally respect the no-take zone as well. So it's you can't just, you said it yourself, you can't just exclude the human contact in this, and you need the human contacts as your allies, but you've just got to manage it in a way in which you recognise that the sense of people's ownership is actually a value that's a benefit to you rather than always a threat.
Susan?
It's also a question of what the narrative is that you're feeding into. So I think one of the challenges we had here with marine parks early on was that while people very much want to be able to have a healthy marine environment in the future for their children, they really want their grandchildren to be able to go fishing, they didn't buy that any activity that they undertook was doing any damage to that. And so it's trying to not be relevant or to be talking at cross purposes with the community. That's probably one of the hardest things to do. And it's certainly what politicians have to deal with all the time, is to frame the questions that you're trying to find answers to in a way that resonates with people, so you have their permission to engage in that particular public policy. And that's where I guess I'm trying to pose the question rather than answer it about the parks agenda. How much is the idea of having parks and spending public money on parks dealing with the very real environmental issues that people do recognise? How does it make sense to them? Is it just it's a recreational place, it's quite nice to go to if you have time, or is it part of a solution to a problem that they share, that they want to see an answer to, whether that's how active their kids are or global warming? I'm not trying to give you what the answer is, but I don't know that at the moment we're quite making parks and environmental expenditure by government particularly relevant and answering questions that the community have. I may be being more jaundiced than the two of you. Possibly I spent too much time with Alan in the last couple of years.
Well, there are obviously a range of reasons we have parks, but I think one of the ones that's been most successful has been the idea that they are healthy places for people to be, that it's a good place to be with your family, for recreation and all the positive benefits out of that. So there's a big human payoff. It's not just an environmental payoff for the park itself, it's this huge human payoff that we get by being in parks. And the mental health benefits, I think, are fairly well reported. And I know for myself, I go to I put my foot on the beach and see the sea, and suddenly all your worries just go away. And I think the important thing is that we have good places like that where everyone feels comfortable about going. I think one other point that you did raise, Alan, that's a disturbing point, is about whether young people are going to use parks enough. And certainly I've read some material that would say that, yes, they are spending more time in front of the telly or YouTube on the computer and not as much outside. And I think we have to, as parents and communities, do more to encourage kids just to go outside, not necessarily at parks, but do that. But it's a bit hard for us to solve all of these problems.
Yeah. Just, I want to go to the question of urban spaces, urban parks, open spaces. Enrique this morning talked about his experiences in Colombia, recreating a city, if you like, in terms of turning towards people and away from motor cars, and the reclaiming public spaces or creating public spaces where people could feel some sort of equality, if you like, that there was something for the poor, that these things weren't just for the rich. And so there was a very strong social element to the design of cities. And then afterwards at morning tea, Enrique probably won't appreciate me saying this, but he said that he'd spent some time in Melbourne recently and he'd been visiting it for a long period of time, and he was saddened to see that we were still building freeways and we weren't creating the public spaces. And I just wonder, as you know, people that in Adelaide and Melbourne, we're building freeways and things for cars, and we're not doing a lot for the public realm. And I just wondered how you might respond to that.
Well, I'd be in agreement with a lot of what he's said. I think while I've been very positive about parks, I'm not terribly positive about urban planning in Australia. That we have an urban planning approach which is very privatised, where we have a single development which is very inward looking. We don't spend any money on the public realm. I don't think it's just a question of freeways versus bikeways. It's actually, we just don't bother with the public realm much. And I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago and just amazed by, all of these not terribly tall buildings, but 5-storey, but pretty dense. But around them all, you've got this urban space which is public, with playgrounds and trees and people talking and doing things. Whereas when we do developments, we just are largely inward looking, and the developer just builds their building and nothing is spent on the public space. So, I'd agree with that.
Robert, a perspective on this?
Well, I think it was because we all had our own park, didn't we? It was a quarter-acre backyard. That was in different societies where you don't have that, you obviously look for something else. I spent quite a lot of time living in New York, and they don't have the backyard. They have a big park, and they love that big park. And come the weekend, they all march out there and they run and they bike and they do everything. So they have a sense of belonging to that park, which is not generally the case, not so much the case anyway in Australia, because our cities were developed differently. Now, I go to a lot of these conferences that are talking about the city of the future, and a lot of people are advocating a different construct to our traditional quarter-acre block, and in which case they do integrate much more green space within the city that's shared space. And they argue, whether it's right or wrong, that you get a more healthy community out of that because they're forced to interrelate with each other more. That's probably calls for a sociologist's expertise rather than mine, but it's I think it's largely historical, the model on which our cities were built.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But we did expect there to be parks outside the cities.
Well, the inner city, the traditional inner city of Melbourne certainly had a lot more dense building and park than our middle and outer suburbs. It's the post-World War II design that's been totally dedicated to our own private space. And so, I live in the inner city. It's a fantastic place to live. We don't have a big backyard. We share a park. But most developments of the last 50 years are not like that in Australia. They have been this private space, your own backyard, never shared.
But what's interesting though is, so I think Robert's response is right, that for a long period of time our park was our backyard. But if you go to the developments that are occurring in this city in the last 10 years, they don't have backyards. They're still spreading across the landscape, single story, occupy the complete block, and there is no backyard and there's no park to go with it. And you wonder what it is that you're creating there. So, where was the foresight to set aside Central Park in New York? Where did that come from? could they conceive when they set that aside that the city would grow to 12 or 14 million? Or so it's interesting. I mean, where does the leadership come from in terms of? Appreciate you might not be a sociologist, Robert, but you've been a politician with influence, and so where does that interest and desire to push those things come from?
It's a hard question because politicians generally worried about the next 3 years. So the foresight to think many generations hence and to ensure that it's good living probably rests with very few. But it's got to be more than, it depends what we're talking about. You're talking about the park then just as a recreational area, or are you talking about it as something that represents a different set of values?
Well, I think it is about a different set of values. That's my personal view. I think this is all about values in the end. And that's what Enrique's saying. It's how you want to live your life, or what you talked about happiness, didn't you, Enrique? Is that what it's about? It's interesting. How do you define happiness? Susan, you were going to jump in.
Well, my sense at the moment we're having a very lively debate in Adelaide about densification, because we've reached that tipping point where people have recognised the disaster that is sprawl, both for the people and also for the environment and even for agriculture. But we haven't yet reached a point where we're prepared to willingly embrace denser living, partly because we tend not to do it very well. So the examples that exist are poor examples of design. It seems to me what's likely to happen over the next few years is that planners and developers will only really get permission from the community to do that densification if they do it better, if they do it with shared public space. I think people are very alert to the quality of their immediate environment, and as I said earlier, that was my experience in door knocking, that people were acutely aware of the lack of quality of their environment, and if they did have reasonable environment, that they were prepared to spend time tending it. I think if I can push it to the next level of challenge, we've talked in the environment world a lot about things like natural infrastructure, which I think was a Robert Kennedy Jr. term, but the idea that the environment is just as important to our economic production as any other hard or soft infrastructure. When driving down a road in Adelaide, I saw a fairly small sort of connecting road being built between two really large roads, and it had a big sign saying, $13 million spent on this by the state government. And I thought, what case needed to be mounted for that? I understand that transport infrastructure overall makes a massive difference to how our economy works. But for that particular little road for $13 million, how hard was it for the department to get that versus how hard would it be for the Environment Department to get $13 million to spend on what we like to call natural infrastructure? And without knowing definitively the answer, I suspect that it's pretty straightforward in the Transport Department and it's really hard in the Environment Department, which is where I come back to the question of, have we actually made the case that what we do matters? I think we've made the case that it matters in at least a peripheral way, in a lifestyle way, in a amenity way, but have we made the case that it really matters to our future? And I don't think we have, and I think it's our responsibility in the world of the environment to do that. I don't blame anybody else for that. But that's where I think, if you're talking about the parks agenda, I would like to see a debate about how significant is it in helping us grapple with what we know to be very serious problems for the future.
If we had a microphone, want to grab a microphone? I want Carmen to just add to this conversation. She can't just be the MC. She's also a former politician of some note, and I'm interested.
It is
Carmen,
true that we didn't ever talk about it in terms of healthy living.
Sorry, Robert?
We never talk about parks in terms of healthy living.
Well,
it's a different. It may be a better set of language to achieve what you're now talking about.
It's interesting, if you trace the history of this Parks Forum, what is it, David, 10, 12 years? And probably for half of that, you've had as a sort of substantial agenda, healthy parks, healthy people, which is a Victorian, I think largely came out of your place, John. So it's something that we've tried, and we're still working on. I think I don't know how successful we are at that. But before we'll come back to that, Rob, I'm going to go to Carmen. What do you see here, and what would you add?
Well, I guess one of the things that first strikes you in this space is how little time people have to spend in the environment. The ABS time of use surveys, most recent data show that Australians, not unlike most people around the world in cities like ours with a fair degree of sprawl and a lot of commuting, spend an average of 4% every day in the outdoors. Now that's just outside their cars and their houses. That's not in parks, that's not recreating, that's not getting together with friends, it's not riding bikes, it's, you know, outdoors, full stop. So there's not a lot of time that we spend there, and I guess the question I always ask is, what are we doing with the rest of our time? And the answer is, a lot of the rest of our time, increasingly in our big cities, is spent commuting, and I'm very sympathetic to the view that Enrique outlined for us today. But it also does require some very significant cultural changes in the way we think about planning, in the quality of urban design, in our capacity to, in a sense, revolutionise the way we think about our place, our space. And as you say, the outer suburban areas of our big cities, the planning is truly awful, and the architecture is not a lot better. And as a result, people are further and further and further out. You ask communities what they care about and what they hate. They hate two things, really hate: commuting for more than about 30 minutes, and for a lot of them, work. So that's a bit of a joke, but I mean, the commuting problem is a serious one. We're a very urban society. We spend a great deal of time thinking about and planning for the movement of people from their homes to their workplaces, and it's time that's dead time. People don't enjoy it. It's not good for their health. So the flip side is trying to find ways of breaking that nexus, and there are lots of questions, obviously, we need to ask about that. I'm a bit with you, Alan. I think that the support for environmental diversity protection, engagement with people in parks, in the political class, is not as strong as it should be. With people like John, Robert Hill, Susan, I don't know you, but I presume you as well, very good support. But the biggest fights I ever had as a Member of Parliament were with my colleagues about environmental protection, development of parks, diversity. There was a lot of hostility, actually, toward those things that didn't matter very much. And I don't think that's changing. I think it's a pretty standard bit of fare. So I'm, on the one hand, I guess, optimistic that we've had some wonderful presentations today, but I do worry that our culture is kind of moving us further and further away from the enjoyment of parks and from the investment in what we need to have livable cities.
Thanks, Carmen. I wouldn't mind going to Enrique just for a moment, if that's okay. Yeah, I think it'll work. Enrique, yeah.
Kimberly, so okay, good. Well, as to what Carmen says, that the people spend and they hate commuting. There was a very sophisticated study done in Texas women, and they asked them, and what they liked most was sex, which speaks good about the Texan men, and what they hated most was commuting. You know, but what I really think is that we are talking and talking. And every Environment 101 and Urban Design 101 in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and which are the countries where have the most sprawl, not because they were dumb, but because they were the most successful societies in the 20th century. So this is why, Bogota has a great density, not because we were great planners, but because we did not have enough money to buy cars and build highways. But the fact is that today we realize this is a huge cost in terms of quality of life, in terms of economic cost, and in terms of the environment. And everybody agrees in this. But the fact is that there are no concrete proposals to increase density, nothing. Of course, in Melbourne we do some nice things downtown and the sidewalks and some nice, very wonderful things, but at the same time, you do some giant highways which will clearly stimulate more the sprawl towards these beltways. And what I don't see is Australia is such an attractive country, so big, so wealthy, so much fun, that it will surely attract a lot of people over the next few decades, and even the population. I mean, these cities are going to grow a lot in Australia. So what I think is lacking really is concrete proposals on how are these cities going to become more dense? How? Policies, what kind of, I mean, if we had a magic wand in the Australian government or in New South Wales government, or if we had a magic wand, first, how would the city be? I mean, we don't even have the ideal city in mind, much less so the means to get there. And I think this is, everybody agrees, I mean, everybody thinks density is the objective. But I think this is where I think we are missing. I don't see where the policies are to get there. And on the other hand, one sees many policies which do not really consciously seek sprawl, but clearly will bring about more sprawl.
Enrique, I'm going to get the panel to respond to both Carmen and you. Susan.
I'm the only sitting member of Parliament on your panel, so I'm conscious of, also being clear about the state government's agenda, which is, but I just don't want to sound too pathetic that I'm advancing the state government agenda, but I think it's a good one. The state government has said that it acknowledges that density has to happen, and I think that it essentially acknowledges that it hasn't happened well to date, which is an important first step. And is working on a couple of example new centres of density that include public space and that are wrapped around the public transport, that if they work, then set the benchmark for how to do this better. We've never done good planning in South Australia. We've done some, arguably the parklands was the first step in that, and even something like Mawson Lakes is very much loved by people who live there and has a very high premium on the public domain. They started with the lake, they started with the shared space, and then they built the housing around it. If I contrast that with Port Adelaide, the very big mistake that was made with Newport Keys was that it started with making some money for developers, essentially, for saying, we'll just build some big tower blocks and people will buy those and then the money will trickle down, and didn't pay any attention to the public amenity that was attached to that. So I think in South Australia there are some lessons that have been learned, and the next few years will prove whether they've been learned appropriately.
Okay, thanks, Susan. John.
Well, Enrique said that there's agreement that there should be greater density. There is agreement from the planners and the experts, but there's not public agreement about that. I mean, that's the reality. That, in fact, there's quite strong opposition to most proposals for medium density development anywhere other than the inner city, and that's a huge challenge for politicians and planners, and it's pretty well embedded. How do you overcome that? Well, I was talking to Carmen Lawrence at lunch today about social norms, that is showing people that something works and other people are doing it. And I can see that as the only way to change this. It has actually happened in the inner city. So in Melbourne, as a metropolitan area, the inner area is the second fastest growing area of Melbourne now. It is growing, and it's very high density in a way that 20 years ago when I was a local councillor, people would never have dreamed. And basically it's because people see other people doing it and people like them living in these places, so they feel comfortable about it. But in the middle and outer suburbs in Australian cities, that's not true. People don't feel that that's something that you do. And the only way I think we can get around that is I think government has to, and I might say South Australian government's probably done more than any other government, has to invest in some model areas to show that you can have greater density and that it's good and you can make money out of it and sell your property, you're not going to go broke. And show that this works.
Robert.
Well, there are niches developing in all of our major cities now, and I've visited some quite a long way outside of Brisbane. They're still seen as a bit experimental, partly because there's always, a new development, there's always a nervousness of getting ahead of what behaviour demands. It's and people start to live that lifestyle and like it, then it'll catch on. But it's I don't think it's something that can be easily imposed. People have got to see the benefits. So I'm thinking about it in terms of carbon. I'm chairing a new cooperative research centre that's just establishing itself at the moment, which is called Low Carbon Living. And one of the things that attracted me to it is that all of a sudden we as public policy makers have realised we've got to also focus on why people haven't become the motivators of a different way of living. For so long we've given them the solutions and handed them down, but they haven't taken them up. So now we're going to start with the people, and we'll have what we call living incubators around Australia, which over the next 7 years, some of these new suburbs that are being developed on a more dense basis and built around public space. Who are the people that are being attracted to that? Why are they? Can they become the drivers of the future that will more broadly change public attitude, and you'll get a much greater uptake in Australia? But it's not. It's not something that can just be turned around overnight.
Okay. Now, I appreciate we've just got a few minutes left, and what I think we should do is give anybody in the audience the opportunity to ask a question, because might be the only opportunity you get to do this. So there's one at the back. Michael, I actually happen to know who that is.
Yeah, Mike.
It's okay, Mark. The guy will turn it on.
Okay, I think I heard the word once in the whole conversation, and that was about investment. What frustrates me as a practitioner is that I rarely hear politicians or governments or even the agencies talk about the investment in open space and conservation areas in the future of our children, and the costs that would save us in terms of health and crime and all those types of reductions that the taxpayers might have to pay. And I actually think if you look at the working class families of our communities these days, they make these decisions based on return on investment. And we don't make that connection of where they should invest their time and effort and their money. And I don't hear governments or politicians talking about that. I think it's a really big gap in our conversation.
I might turn that back on you, Mike, because perhaps this is a criticism of this group that we don't put the case.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we're as much the fault as governments are, and governments need to be advised by us as a group. Yeah.
Okay, what I might do is keep going around and then we'll get some comment. So at the front, that's Steve, I think. Steve.
Thank you. This is a question for you, John. I'm with Parks Victoria. As part of the Future Leaders group that we had yesterday, we spoke about coping mechanisms for new governments making new decisions, and how in some cases that went against staff's values. When you were in office, a major initiative was to remove cattle from the high country in Victoria. And with our election cycle that just happened, we got a new government through, and one of the first things they did was reintroduce cattle to the high country, albeit for testing purposes or for some sort of understanding of the impacts that cattle have. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us your reaction or your feelings towards cattle going back in.
So, Steve, I'm going to just have a go at you. Do you want the particular instance or the principle? Which one do you want to go?
I wouldn't mind John's feelings and his thoughts about something he put in place, seeing it disappear straight away.
We'll go to the particular issue, but I wouldn't mind coming back to the principle.
Oh, well, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that I think it's a terrible decision, and it was a cynical political decision by the new government to get support from one group, the mountain cattlemen. And it was dressed up as a scientific research project to investigate the impact of cattle on grazing and the impact that would have on fire. Well, there's been 50 years of research that shows that not only do cattle do damage, that they don't have any positive impact on reducing fire in the Alpine Park. But I guess the broader point you make about how do you do that in Parks Victoria, I guess you're part of the public service, and democracy means that you follow the government of the day. So I understand you have to do that, but I'm not part of that anymore, so I can express my views.
So Steve, really that's my point. It's a point I tried to make yesterday, that it seems to me the contract between a public servant is between that and the government of the day, and the government of the day is elected. So sometimes you make a choice. Do you want to keep working for them? Do you do their bidding, or don't you? I've already, this is a mea culpa, when I first came to South Australia, talk about the public realm, we had these appalling things, we still do, these things called shacks scattered around our seashores on the public realm, and a government was elected on the basis that they would freehold those shacks, to which I was bitterly opposed. But then as a public servant I had to deliver that for that government. I had a choice. Do I do that, or do I go and work somewhere else? And I often think that's the harsh reality of being a public servant. Sometimes that's the way it is. You make a choice. Okay, this particular. Thanks, Steve. Good on you. We've got that one cleared up. Okay, who else? Where else are we? Down the back, over the far right-hand side. Eastern corner. Ingrid.
Yes, I was very interested in the new CRC about the low carbon living, and I was wondering if anyone has looked at early adopters and if they have better health generally than the people that come along and follow later. And I was wondering if one of the things that the CRC will look at is the health of people that move into these new low carbon houses and developments. And if that's something that you had considered.
Yes, they are. It's being picked up quite enthusiastically at the moment, and CSIRO of all people or organisations is now leading in this area. I saw some stuff early this year which fascinated me, and that was some research that had been done on so-called green schools, which are common sense basically, schools that allow the fresh air to come in and have got natural light and the colours are sensible, and they found that the kids were getting better results and the teachers were happier. You might say, well, that all sort of makes sense. But I don't think we've ever really thought about parks quite in that same way. So parks for healthy living strikes me as a pretty good war cry if you want to get a deeper community commitment, if you're particularly talking about urban parks.
Thanks, Rob. We're out of time, so I'm going to give the panel the last word here, just a parting comment. Susan.
I think what interested me about the question about the cattle, and I don't know the detail of that specifically, goes to the heart of the larger point I was trying to make. Adjacent landholders, whether it's people living in houses in the city or whether it's farmers nearby to what we call a national park, if they don't value what that park's doing, if they don't believe that it's giving them a return, then they will either simply not want investment in it or they'll actually want to harm it. So the onus is very much on people who are doing the environmental work to demonstrate why it matters to them and why it's productive and useful. And I know that it's not always simple, but that relationship between on-park and off-park, whether the off-park is conservation land, production land, or residential or industrial, it doesn't matter. The on-park, off-park relationship is the one that's really crucial. We have parks. The parks themselves work pretty well. We could always spend more money on them. But what difference are they making is probably the relationship outside of the park.
Thanks, Susan. John?
Well, I suppose two things come out of the discussion we've had today that have particularly impressed me. One is sort of the point that Enrique was making around the need to change urban planning, and I suppose I'd say that perhaps parks professionals like yourselves need to be spear carriers for better urban planning as well as doing your own parks. And the other point was the point that Carmen just raised about only 4% of our time is spent outside, and then I've been fiercely working out my own personal statistics and realising that it's a very, very small amount of time. And one group that could have an impact on that is employers, and really, whether perhaps those of you who are employers here too, you'll probably give your employees more time outside than most. But if we are going to be healthy, we do need to be outside. There's plenty of evidence of that. And perhaps employers need to get the message and encourage that with their staff.
Thanks, John. Robert?
Well, I remember when cattle on the high country passed across my desk, and I said it was estate issues.
Well, I wish your successors had done the same thing.
I think that if we talk about I see two different areas really. The big area of Australia is an enormously rich and rare biodiversity, and the responsibility we all have, and I'd like to see even more education on that area to ensure that people do understand what a wonderful inheritance we have and what important legacy it is, and it'll require effort to meet that responsibility. But in the urban environment, I found it a particularly interesting discussion because when we've talked about cities of the future, we've focused on energy, on water, on waste, and on transport. The communities I work with and move in haven't focused on parks. So perhaps we've just sort of assumed that as part of the solution, and it requires a bit more effort as well to ensure that it is worked up as an essential part. And as I said, I like the concept of the healthy living approach because, again, I think it's probably right. Instinctively, you think it's right. Get people outside, they are going to be better off. They've got to go outside and be somewhere. And it may be one of those levers that can be pulled a bit more effectively.
Friends, thank you very much for being so generous with your time. I really do appreciate that you have busy lives and to have given up a bit to talk to us. Greatly appreciated. So Robert, John, Susan, thank you very much.
Good luck with it all, too.